Today on Uncommon Knowledge, my Bonnie job lies over the ocean.
Funding for this program is provided by the John M. OLIN Foundation.
Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. Our show today, Outsourcing. Is sending jobs overseas bad or good for America? Senator John Kerry calls corporate executives who send jobs overseas Benedict Arnold CEOs. President Bush counters that we cannot wall ourselves off against economic globalization. Is outsourcing, whether it means sending customer service jobs to India or manufacturing jobs to China, a net gain or loss for the United States? And if American workers are being hurt by outsourcing, what should be done? Joining us today, three guests. Kenneth Judd is a fellow at the Hoover Institution. Harley Shakin is a professor specializing in labor and the global economy at the University of California at Berkeley. And Stephen Haber is a professor of history and political science at Stanford University. Gregory Mankiw, chairman of the President's Council of Economic Advisors, I quote him, "Outsourcing is just a new way of doing international trade. More things are tradable than were tradable in the past, and that's a good thing." Close quote. Senator John Forbes Kerry, once again I quote him, "My economic policy is not to export American jobs. Unlike the Bush administration, I want to repeal every tax break and loophole that rewards any Benedict Arnold CEO or corporation for shipping American jobs overseas." Close quote. Mankiw or Kerry, who has the right attitude? Stephen?
Mankiw.
Harley?
Kerry, without question.
Kenneth?
There's some truth in both. I'm more likely on the Mankiw side.
All right. The jobless recovery and outsourcing. Since President Bush took office, the economy's lost some 2.3 million jobs. Even now that the economy is growing handsomely, as we tape this show, new jobs are only being created at the rate of about 100,000 a month, very feeble. Harley, I quote you to yourself. "Clearly not all of these jobs, lost jobs, have been outsourced, but outsourcing has played a very important role." Please, close quote. Explain yourself.
Well, outsourcing and offshoring, that is both white-collar jobs and manufacturing.
Outsourcing is used to mean
usually white-collar jobs, and offshoring usually means manufacturing.
All right.
I think have, in fact, combined played a very major role in the number of jobs that have been lost. In the last 42 months, manufacturing alone has dropped 2.8 million jobs. And out of manufacturing, a good chunk, perhaps a third to a half, might be attributable to outsourcing. We don't have the exact, to offshoring, I mean. We don't have the exact figures, but this is a very significant phenomenon to date. And I think even more importantly, we may be at the beginning of the curve in terms of what both are likely to do in the near future.
The lost jobs.
Well, it's clear that there's a jobless recovery. Some of it is due to outsourcing and offshoring, but not all of it is due to outsourcing and offshoring. And those that are due to, quote, outsourcing or offshoring, there's a question that needs to be asked, which is, how many of those jobs would you have held on to anyway? Right? There's always an implicit notion in these numbers when they're thrown around that something you could have done would have prevented them from leaving. What the something you could have done is often left unspecified.
Ken, I just want to pin down one. Do you consider the proportion of jobs lost to outsourcing significant?
No, the government statistics that try to look at this say it's a small fraction of number of jobs lost.
Small fraction means 10%?
Less than 10%. It's nowhere near 10%.
Okay.
Then
fighting words, Harley.
White-collar jobs?
Well, no, can we just stipulate, for the purposes of television, which is a simplifying medium, outsourcing and offshoring are the same thing?
Absolutely.
Jobs going overseas.
Yeah.
All right, go ahead.
Now, the other thing to keep in mind when we talk about the jobless recovery is that what we're talking about is a net number. There's millions of jobs being created each month. There's millions of jobs that are lost each month for a variety of reasons. Some may...
Let's take a closer look at job loss in one particular sector of the economy, manufacturing. According to economists at Alliance Capital Management, between 1995 and 2002, the United States lost 11% of its manufacturing jobs, which sounds startling. Until you read on and discover that Japan lost 16% of its manufacturing jobs, and even China suffered a 15% drop. In other words, we're not losing manufacturing jobs to other countries so much as we are losing manufacturing jobs to greater productivity. Manufacturing is simply following the same pattern that agriculture followed 80 and 100 years ago, which is to say you can produce more and more and more with fewer and fewer workers, and that's no bad things because who wants to work on an assembly line all the time?
That's not what I get out of the Alliance figures. China and the U.S., for example, are losing manufacturing jobs for very different reasons. China had a huge part of its manufacturing base that was very antiquated and bloated under the previous state regime. Now that China is developing as an export power, the overall number is contracting, but the number of export-related jobs are increasing very rapidly. The U.S.
Because you're getting modern factories.
Absolutely. So it's very, very different. It's apples and oranges. I think to put the numbers in perspective and why they're very, very serious, when we say that we've lost almost 3 million manufacturing jobs in the last 42 months, you know, one's eyes glaze over. But to put that in perspective, we had a huge debate in this country in the early 1980s about the Chrysler Corporation, whether or not Chrysler would survive, and $1 billion in loan guarantees were given. The huge national crisis that provoked this was the loss of 140,000 Chrysler jobs. We, over the last 42 months, have lost the equivalent of a Chrysler Corporation every other month. That's serious, and outsourcing plays a very central role in that.
Okay, so go ahead, Steve.
You know, I'm always surprised about these arguments about outsourcing because one of the arguments that's always been made in the United States is that we need to do something about developing other countries, and that there's gross inequities between countries. And in the last decade, one of the things that's happened is a lot of relatively high skill, high wage jobs have moved to other countries, which is what we usually call economic development. And now we find ourselves in a position, right, of saying that, oh, well, we didn't mean economic development of that variety. It's economic development when it's, you know, knitting Guatemalan book bags. But when it's producing Sony television sets or automobiles, all of a sudden, we don't like that kind of economic development. But it's part of our national policy to be in favor of economic, and it's in our interest.
I would agree with Steve. I think he's got an important, up to a point, he's got an important issue here. We want an internationalist vision. The issue isn't that outsourcing in and of itself is bad. It's why outsourcing is taking place. And if it's taking place because a country is repressing labor or pushing down on wages, that's the issue.
Hold on. Listen to the shaken thesis here, okay? Harley's thesis, quote, "There are times when wages are set more by the strong arm of the state than by the invisible hand of the market. When a country attracts investment by jailing union leaders or ignoring safety on the job, the net result isn't some natural form of comparative advantage, but what amounts to a repression bonus," close quote. That's what's going on in China. They have no unions. You talk back to the government and talk for greater safety standards on the job. They throw you in jail. We shouldn't be doing business with those people. We shouldn't be permitting American corporations to set up factories over there.
This is a political question. It's a moral question.
You're not going to make the economic argument that they're better off as a result of it?
If they are being jailed for union activity and they're being repressed, I have a hard time agreeing that they're better off. And there are two issues here. One is political repression, and how do we deal with it? Do we have economic sanctions against China or against South Africa or against whatever regime we're talking about? Now, when it comes to India, I don't think that's an issue. When talking about outsourcing, we're also talking about India. It's not just China we're talking about India and other countries where these political issues are not as severe, and we're talking about fairly open regimes. Okay. And on the job issue, I want to say that, I think we're talking too much about jobs in the United States. What's important is how much money are people taking home
in the United
States. And even though we're seeing these losses of jobs and jobs going offshore for one reason or another for the last 20, 30, 40 years in various industries, the question is what's happening to the standard of living in the United States for the typical worker? And that's going up generally on average over the last 20 years.
Hold on. Ken says the standard of living for U.S. workers is going up.
But that's not true for all workers, is it?
Former Secretary of Labor Robert Reich, quote, "The pay of most personal service workers in the United States." Reich has an argument whereby anybody who's involved, he calls them symbolic workers, people who work with their minds, are doing just fine. But there's a second category, and he calls them personal service workers. Their pay in the United States is stagnant or declining. That's because the supply of such workers is growing quickly as more and more people who'd otherwise have factory or other jobs join their ranks. In other words, restaurant workers, cabbies, security guards, retail workers are all finding their wages held down largely because of outsourcing. It's not just jobs lost, it's wages depressed. Steve.
There are two issues here. One is whether or not there really is stagnant wage growth for people in what Reich wants to call service jobs.
And I think 2003, absolutely.
Right. And I was going
there's no issue.
And I was going to say that if you look at the median family income in the United States since the 1980s, it's the median has not grown very much. It's been fairly flat. Now there's another issue, which is an issue raised by Ken, and it's an important one because when we talk about people's standard of living, outsourcing in a way helps it, although we rarely think about it. One of the reasons why people shop at Walmart.
You keep talking, but I'm going to watch
One of
Harvey's
the
face
reasons why
during
people
this.
shop. One of the reasons why people shop at Walmart is because the prices are low. Why are the prices low? Because those goods are produced overseas more efficiently than they could have been produced in the United States.
We could make them even lower by repealing the Occupational Safety and Health Act in the U.S. Not to have any health standards or minimum wages.
Doing away with OSHA. Don't tempt us.
It's a devil's bargain.
But the argument I'm simply making is that you can't have it both ways, right? And you have to recognize that a lot of that outsourcing actually generates benefits for the United States. There's a really interesting article recently by Chris Michener at Santa Clara University. He said, look, the United States has been outsourcing for over 100 years, from state to state. Net, what's been the effect on the standard of living in the United States? It's improved.
You're going to go with that?
Oh, absolutely.
Within the United States, sure.
There's no question that over long periods of time, countries that practice free trade policies have higher standards of living. That the United States is a great example of a free trade union. Europe is a good example.
You accept that as well?
I accept that in the U.S., the outsourcing from state to state.
No. This the larger argument.
Even within the EU.
I think free trade is a wonderful possibility, and I think free trade can bring broad-based benefits. But the rules of the game is what's critical here. And I think the issue when it comes to outsourcing, when it comes to Walmart, for example, Walmart accounts for 10% of total U.S. imports from China last year, $12 billion. If we get that based on repression and a denial of rights in Beijing, we're going to have that same denial of rights sooner or later in the same labor market in East Moline, Illinois, or in Fresno, California.
You go with that?
If, in fact, wages are set in China, and I don't know if it's true, but if wages are set through a kind of repressive labor system, right, then that clearly is a problem.
Certainly with certain American workers, if they're competing with Chinese workers or Indian workers or Malaysian workers that get 30 cents an hour, 40 cents an hour, whatever, that's going to hurt. That they're competing with those, and that's going to hurt their wages that they can get in this country.
So if you're supplying tires or antenna assemblies to Ford or GM, you're either going to meet the Chinese price or you're out of business. And that's going to hurt.
But in the United States, when that's happened, these workers lose their jobs for a while, go back into the job market. Maybe they have to spend 6 months, 9 months, 12 months finding a job, but they typically do. And maybe not at first, it's not as good as the old job they had, but a couple years down the road, they'll get basically back up to their old standard of living.
Next, does economic theory need to catch up to the changing conditions of free trade in the real world?
Economists tend to support free trade for the reasons that David Ricardo laid out 200 years ago, and that is the law of comparative advantage, which you will now express in television terms, briefly and understandably.
We're all better off if people do what they do well, what they can do well, and then trade with other people or other countries.
Okay,
and
so if you grow coffee in Guatemala and cotton in Egypt, and they're both best at that, that's what they should be doing.
Egypt should not be growing coffee, and Guatemala should not be growing cotton.
Okay, hold on. Now listen to the economist Paul Craig Roberts, quote, "In the traditional free trade model, countries have different endowments. Different climates give different advantages to the production of different crops. Different histories and inclinations result in different advantages in finance, skills, and manufacture. But if there are no given endowments because business know-how, capital, and technology are globally mobile. The advantage lies with countries with untapped pools of educated and skilled low-wage labor. Close quote. The assertion here is that conditions are fundamentally different and that economists who still believe in unexamined free trade policies simply haven't taken into account the changed conditions of the high technology world. Dr. Judd?
Endowments are important, but the key endowment for the United States is not mobile. The key endowment in the United States is that we have a couple 100 million highly skilled, educated workers that are integrated into the world economy and are flexible and can move from task to task when economic opportunities present themselves.
Hold on.
And this is not true in other countries.
Hold on. I'll get back to you in a moment, Harley. In the middle, just hold him down, would you please? All right, Paul Craig Roberts once again. This is for you, Steve. Quote, the enormous untapped labor pools in China, India, Indonesia, and the Philippines exceed in size the United States population. They are sufficiently large to hold down living standards and wages in those countries until all U.S. manufacturing and information technology jobs have been outsourced in order to boost corporate profits, close quote. In other words, in principle, there's no reason this shouldn't keep going until every factory is shipped overseas and every computer and customer service job is shipped overseas.
At the time that America signed the NAFTA agreement, an argument was made that all of American manufacturing jobs are going to move to Mexico. Because wages in Mexico
Ross Perot's giant sucking
because
sound.
That argument was flawed then.
Go ahead.
Let me
I promise you.
Right.
you'll
So,
get a chance, Harley.
in fact, we didn't lose jobs because of NAFTA. Net. No, some jobs moved to Mexico, and some industries actually did better because they had better access to the Mexican market. And some industries were able to continue, parts of them could continue to exist in the United States precisely because you could produce part of the product in Mexico. Mm-hmm. So one of the arguments that's often made like this is it's a kind of all or nothing. Either you have all these jobs and none of these jobs, and people don't consider the counterfactual. If you don't take part of the production platform and move it elsewhere, you're likely to lose the whole industry. NAFTA is an example of a phenomena where you kept parts of industries in the United States, particularly design and engineering, and you moved some of the production to Mexico. You might have lost the whole thing.
You get an answer, but please make it quick. Because
let me reiterate what the basis of this is, that why things are so different today. We have a situation where the most sophisticated, advanced kinds of work are subject to outsourcing, not because of more competitive educational systems, not because of more entrepreneurial people, but because of labor repression in many of the countries where wages are lowest.
There is labor repression in India. This outsourcing, for example, you get service on Dell computer.
Right. If an American worker finds his wages depressed because his job he's competing with Indian workers, that's okay with you. Because in India, there's
no tech outsourcing is Indian workers. Yeah.
Here's why 84% last year, 84% of all foreign direct investment in developing countries went to China. That's why I'm emphasizing China so much. But it's not a case of...
On to some practical advice for George W. Bush and John F. Kerry.
Harley, what should John Kerry do about the problems that you see?
I think there are several things that John Kerry should do, all within the internationalist vision that he has laid out. Embrace trade, but the current situation squanders the possibility of trade. So he should specifically ask for the kind of tax revisions that he has recently proposed, where corporations would not get tax breaks for shipping work overseas. He should also embed labor and environmental standards into trade agreements to establish the kind of rules of the game that caused our domestic economy to prosper with outsourcing between states. And he should have adjustment issues for those who are negatively affected in the U.S. We should
Walmart isn't allowed to import toys and textiles from China unless the workers who produce those toys are completely free to form unions, work in factories that meet American or close to American standards for safety. Is that what you're after?
No. The workers in China ought to have the right to form unions if they choose. If they don't want unions, that should be their decision. But they should have certain basic rights that allow Chinese workers to share in development and growth.
But
and
you're
to
asking
expand
John
trade.
Forbes Kerry to institute a trade policy that overturns the political regime in China.
Not whatsoever. This is all possible within the context of what China could do as a development
Okay,
strategy.
Stephen, what should George W. Bush do?
Well, I'd rather advise John Kerry, but since you're giving me the task of advising Bush.
You're stuck with it, Buster.
Yeah, well.
You and Karl Rove.
I really now want to
Go ahead.
I would tell him to be very careful when people make arguments about outsourcing and quickly point to China as the problem. A lot of outsourcing is high-tech jobs, and the reason people are upset about it, I would tell him, is because these tend to be very high-paying, skilled jobs that we tended to think of as American jobs. But they're going to places like India, and they're going to places like India because India's been building a comparative advantage in those industries. It is an
Because
American.
India pays a lot of attention to education.
Right. I would also tell him that it is in America's interest that the other countries with whom we are engaged around the world should be prosperous, not poor. And they should have well-paying jobs in those countries. And that is, in fact, the best thing we can do for American national security is have prosperous partners. If you want a prosperous America, then what you want to do is not tinker with the tax code. What you want to do is invest in human capital in the United States.
Now, if there are tax elements in the current tax code which encourage American companies to hire foreign workers instead of American workers, then those should be changed. I don't think there's any dispute on that the tax code should not have a bias against American workers.
Does it?
Yeah, absolutely.
In what ways?
Right now, if you invest abroad, you can reinvest the profits without them being taxed at U.S. rates as long as you keep investing abroad. That's precisely what Senator Kerry is seeking to change.
How does that affect employment in the U.S. on the part of those corporations?
It creates a built-in tax advantage to continuing to invest abroad, not for sales abroad, not for sales in India, but for export back to the
You're only
US.
talking about one source of earnings, and that's internal cash.
Sure.
And the fact is that American corporations have plenty of cash on hand, typically mature corporations have plenty of cash on hand to hire new workers and expand capacity in the U.S. They don't need the cash that's abroad. The fact that it stays abroad is not having much, if any, impact on employment decisions here in the United States because they've got plenty of cash.
Would you object? Do you object to Kerry's?
If it's not important, there should be no problem in terms of repealing it, as Senator Kerry
That's the problem.
suggests.
So would you object to Kerry's proposal, which is to say he's going to close what he calls a loophole and lower the overall corporate tax rate from 35 to 33.25%? Do you object to that?
Probably so. I mean, the fact that the money is abroad, making lots of good investments, just means that American corporations are more profitable in the long run and rebounds back to having benefits for American investors in those companies.
You answer that argument.
Finally, some closing predictions.
According to a consulting firm called Forrester Research, by 2015, some 3.3 million American jobs will have been moved overseas. That is just 1% of the jobs that will have been destroyed through the usual churning process. 1%. Fairly significant. Does that sound about right to you? Higher? What do you think?
About right, but
about right. So we're not at the beginning of some enormous. You're not going to be hearing a giant sucking sound, to quote Ross Perot. No. You don't buy it. Steve?
No giant sucking sound. We didn't see with that.
Those are just white-collar jobs that Forrester is talking about, not the manufacturing job. If you combine it, to paraphrase the former Senator Everett Dirksen, a million jobs here, a million jobs there, pretty soon we're talking about real jobs.
Last question. Let me set it up with a quotation from Tom Sowell, economist Thomas Sowell. Quote, "Since the economic recovery has not yet reached the stage when new jobs are being created to the extent expected and hoped, the idea that American jobs are being sent overseas has political mileage, whether or not it has much economic substance." Close quote. This time next year, with the presidential election behind us, will outsourcing remain an issue of any importance? Steve?
Outsourcing is going to be a major social issue in the United States and a major political issue for some time, because one of the recent things that's happened in outsourcing is it's not just manufacturing jobs. Right. It is now jobs that used to be considered white-collar, sort of semi-permanent jobs, particularly in engineering.
So this is a big one, and it's here to stay.
And those people vote, and they're politically sophisticated, and so this will continue to be an issue.
You'd agree with that?
Absolutely. This is an issue because it's about the kind of globalization we want to see. Do we want to see a broadly shared prosperity globally where nations trade increasingly based on commonly accepted rules, or do we want to say those rules are only good enough for patents and intellectual property?
My skeptical,
rights?
hard-headed friend, this is an issue which has just been puffed up by the current political moment and will blow away.
No, trade issues have been going on for decades. And with international trade, there are always some losers. Maybe they have a different identity than they used to, but there's always been losers. And typically they find some way to express that politically. But over time, we generally find a way for the winners to help the losers. But as
an
their
issue,
temporary losses, and then we move on and have a free trade policy.
as an
winners
issue,
are profiting off the losers.
I'll
That's what's wrong.
Stop, I'm wrapping up the show. You can't launch new arguments. As an issue, outsourcing is here to stay.
International trade issues will always be with us, whatever the name is. The name may change, but it'll always be here.
Ken Judd, Steve Haber, and Harley Shaken, thank you very much. I'm Peter Robinson for Uncommon Knowledge. Thanks for joining us.
Funding for this program was provided by the John M. Olin Foundation.
I'm PBS.